Because Kate had been moaning that you'd been gone a long time watching the football.
I'm almost certain that when I came out, I came over and he was here.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're going to deal with the article A Pact of Silence published in Sol, a Portuguese publication by Felicia Cabrita and Margarita Davim on the 30th of June 2007. Obviously, the original article was published in Portuguese, and as a result, many people, even people who've been following this case for 5, 10, even 15 years, may have actually heard about the article, but they haven't read the article in full. And so, for the first time, many of you will be hearing and seeing this article narrated in full from start to finish. And that's what we'll be dealing with in this episode. The reason we want to do this is get a sense of just how much was known within 2 months of Madeleine McCann disappearing. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So as you can see, this is the original article. The link to Sol has been removed online since, but this is the original text of the article. I'll place a link to this in the description so that you can read it on your own at your own leisure. But yeah, we're now going to go through this article and see exactly what was known by the journalists, by the media, very shortly after Madeleine's disappearance. And it reads, Madeleine's parents and the friends with whom they spent their holidays in Praia de Luz are suspects in the inquiry. I think that's quite important to emphasize. Madeleine's parents and the friends who they spent their holidays in Praia de Luz are suspects in the inquiry. There are contradictory versions about the night of the kidnapping and an assumed pact of silence in the group, right? It's quite important to emphasize that it's an assumed pact of silence. But now let me ask you the following. If you say there was no pact of silence, then you say when the group told the authorities their various versions, why do you think the authorities wanted a reenactment, right? That's the first question. And so one would assume because there were contradictory versions, right? So you want a reenactment just to get a sense of, oh, this is actually what happened. The other reason why I think one can see perhaps a certain amount of reinforcement for an assumed pact of silence is that the reenactment that the Polizia Judiciaria asked for never actually occurred. So you have these contradictory versions. There's an assumed pact of silence. Well, if there was a pact of silence, you can assume that the group wouldn't want to participate in a reenactment because that would be the opposite of a pact of silence. It would be a pact of cooperation, wouldn't it? Right? So the article goes on to say, the beginning of June is flowing in a strange way in the Algarve. A chilly wind and overhead clouds help to fill the auditorium of Lagos, where a solidarity concert is being held for the missing English girl. It's been a month since Madeleine McCann vanished without a trace. This solidarity concert, one imagines, was arranged by, I don't know this for a fact, but one would imagine it was part of all the publicity arranged by the McCanns or by their spokespeople or by their marketing people. Anyway, it says, a few kilometers from Lagos in the Ocean Club Resort at Praia de Luz, the faint illumination further densifies the climate. Quite poetic writing here. At the reception, which leads to the tapas restaurant, there is nobody. Getting inside is easy. A Portuguese waiter, but with a British behavior, strikes the first blow to the journalist's plan. We only serve dinner to the club's clients. What about a drink? The journalist asks. He says yes. And so this is the premise they use to access the tapas club and get a sense of what it is like inside and what the view is like from the tapas restaurant back to the apartment, right? I've also got to say, when I was in Praia de Luz in May 2019, there was absolutely nothing happening at the tapas restaurant. It was really very quiet. It was also, there's nobody. It goes on to say, it's 9:30 p.m. if we were to believe the several members of the McCann's holiday group, and after several mismatching versions. This is a second reference to contradictory versions. Madeleine was being carried out of her apartment by a dark-haired man who would have been around 35 years old. And look at the time there. That's the time that they are thinking about, 9:30 p.m. From the same table where the group of 9 had dinner on that evening, one tries in vain to observe the apartment's front. What she's kind of saying there is they're actually sitting at the same table where the tapas 9 had dinner. And they say from that position, they tried in vain to see the front of the apartment. It says, a ground floor apartment that faces the restaurant. Linoleum screen on the side of the tapas and the corridor of the bushes that follows the limits of the apartment's backyard prevents any vigilance to that level. I'm not quite sure what to make of that, because as far as I know, the linoleum screen could possibly be filled up. It could be rolled up, as you have in many cases. So I'm not sure whether that is necessarily pertinent, which is why I've got this question mark here. The image of Madeleine, big blue questioning eyes and an innocent smile fixed on the photographic films, is always present. It doesn't leave the conversations of whom passes by. As far as I understand what she's talking about here, there are pictures or missing posters on the plastic film of the restaurant, I guess. It says, it doesn't leave the conversations of whom passes by. One remembers the words that the mother, Kate Healy, is supposed to have said to her friend, and that the husband, Jerry McCann, did not know. I had a bad premonition about my children, when I found out the Ocean Club had no babysitting service. And do you think that's true? Do you think it's true that the Ocean Club had no babysitting service? The other thing that I think is really interesting is that Kate Healy is referred to as Kate Healy and not Kate McCann. I find that very interesting, because the detective Amaral also refers to her as Kate Healy. It's quite interesting, isn't it? And so she's supposed to have said to her friend, I had a bad premonition about my children when I found out the Ocean Club had no baby listening service. And so one wonders, where did that statement even come from? Because is that statement even accurate? Now we go to the next paragraph. The choice of Algarve as a holiday destination would come to change their lives. Everything was arranged with 3 other couples. That's quite important to emphasize. Everything that the McCanns arranged, also arranged with 3 other couples. Everything that the other couples arranged, the McCanns arranged as well. What they did in solidarity. And so one's actually kind of got to not see the McCanns as individuals in this, but as a group. And so what was this group doing? What was this group up to? How was this group behaving? It goes on to say, some of them had recently been to Greece with their children, and the Mark Warner agency, the same that prepared their trip to the Algarve, had done their itinerary for the islands. According to their reports, the hotel where they stayed had a baby listening service, a service that is assured by 4 or 5 members. So I think they're referring to a previous hotel that they'd stayed at. A previous Mark Warner hotel that they'd stayed at did have a baby listening service. And it says that is assured by 4 or 5 members of staff who would control the children while the adults dined. by listening through the doors and windows to confirm that everything inside was quiet. It's a little bit badly written, this, because it's difficult to see whether they are talking about a hotel in Greece, but it seems like where they say, what do they say? The hotel where they stayed had a baby listening service. According to their reports, the hotel where they stayed had a baby listening service, a service that is assured by 4 or 5 members of staff who would control the children while the adults dined. This seems to be, emphasizing that the staff members of the Ocean Club, 4 or 5 members of the Ocean Club, are saying that there was a baby listening service provided by the Ocean Club, which, doesn't that make sense? That the Ocean Club was providing a baby listening service. Unless I'm mistaken, unless this is referring to a baby listening service at a hotel in Greece. At the Tapas Bar, from bartenders to staff from the kids club, criticism is whispered. We have a creche. We have a creche where they left their children for most part of the day, where they could be until 11:30 p.m. without spending another euro. They could also have used our babysitters who stay with the children in their rooms until 1 p.m. In this case, they would have to pay an extra fee, but these people looked like they could afford it, an employee comments, concluding that this was a very strange group that never stayed with their children. So if I understand this correctly, in Greece they used a baby listening service, and there was no baby listening service in Praia de Luz. Instead, there were other services such as babysitters who actually stay with the children in their rooms, and it seems like they didn't want that. And if they did that, it would cost an extra fee. And then there was also Kids Club, where children would stay in a creche for most of the day. So it seems like the issue is there wasn't a baby listening service. It seems like the doctors specifically wanted a baby listening service. Now we go to the children's routine. If you think about it, what is actually better, a baby listening service or an actual babysitter who's right there, dealing with the kids? Now we deal with the children's routine. The story of Madeleine looks like a tangled ball of wool. In the last days of April, Kate and Jerry, both 39 and doctors, arrive with their friends in Praia de Luz. The weather is not very good, but the group makes the best of it. Now, what I think is quite interesting here is if the weather was not very good during the day, what do you do at night? If you're on holiday and the weather's not really very good during the day, you can't really go to the beach, you can't really enjoy yourself, then isn't all that's left to enjoy yourself the night? You go out at night and you have a few drinks, and that is when you enjoy yourself, including when the children are not around. And then it says here, the children seem to exist outside of the adults' world. In the morning, Kate would take Madeleine, almost 4, and the 2-year-old twins to the kids' club. The other couples in the group did the same. While the little ones entertained themselves with collages and paintings, the group divided itself between tennis and jogging until lunchtime. So you kind of get this idea that the adults were active, that they were playing tennis and they were jogging for much of the morning. And I must say, when I was in Praia de Luz, I found a lot of people were also playing tennis when I was there. There are tennis courts all over the place. There are also people jogging all over the place, and there are quite a few jogging routes going on both sides of Praia de Luz, one going up the Roja Negra, and another one that is a flatter jogging route going in the other direction. In the creche, the girls' picture is taken she was shy and had some difficulty in adapting to the group. She always stayed close to the English children she already knew. It is at lunchtime that the families socialize a bit. After a nap, the children go back to the kids' club while the parents use the activities that the club offers. They only get to meet again in the late afternoon when the children's dinner is served. And this is where it's quite important, this part here. Before 8 p.m., Madeleine and her siblings, who seem to function like a clock, are already asleep. So these are the words of the journalist that describe Madeleine and her siblings functioning like a clock, that they seem to go to sleep like clockwork. So before 8 o'clock, all the kids are asleep, and then half an hour later, in other words, at 8:30, the group of friends meet at tapas. And one wonders, do they all tend to meet at exactly the same time? The staff, remember, they only leave at midnight. So they arrive at 8:30, and then they leave at midnight, almost 4 hours later. So they are away from their children at night, and these are young children, for 4 hours. The staff described them as being very lively and drank a bit too much. I didn't even realize they had children because I never saw them around. And now we deal with some of the members from the Tapa 7 based on this article. Matthew Oldfield, one of the members in the group, is back in England. He reacts with surprise upon the contact of Sol, but he does not avoid the conversation. He's sort of like, we drank, we were on holiday, so what? And thus the days followed one upon another at the Ocean Club. The holiday week is almost over and the group's spirit does not change. Nobody had noticed until then how the children were kept at a distance. So it's kind of just a sense that day after day after day, the group go out at night, and it's sort of, I won't say wine, woman and song, but certainly a merry time at the tapas restaurant. The most reliable way to understand what happened on May 3rd, when Madeleine disappeared, is to analyze the various versions that emerged. And that brings us to the next page. It would have been 10 p.m. when Kate decided to check the children at the apartment. Now, one doesn't really get a sense in terms of the preceding days that the group got up to check on their children. You kind of got the idea that they arrived at the restaurant and then they sort of had dinner and then they all returned at the same time. They all arrived at the same time, had dinner, and then all returned, right? And then on the day that Madeleine disappears, it seems like there's a lot of babysitting and checking going on. It seems like on that day, there's this frenetic musical chairs scenario going on. But if you think about it, if they arrived at the restaurant at, say, 8 o'clock, 8:30, 10 o'clock is still a really late time for Madeleine's mother to check on her for the very first time. But that is the story. It says, it would have been 10 p.m. when Kate decided to check the children at the apartment. This is the only moment in the story that gathers consensus. So in other words, they are saying, and this is the view of the journalist, that this time, 10 p.m., when Kate decided to check on the children, everyone agrees on that. Madeleine had vanished from her bedroom and the twins were sleeping like nothing had happened. So even that is a bit strange. Madeleine's not there and the twins are fast asleep. The mother was back at the restaurant in one leap. She was disoriented. The Polizia Giudiziaria were called 2 hours later. That's the next paragraph. In seconds, the resort is in turmoil. The group's 4 men and the club's employees check every corner. And this is, I've encircled this for a reason. They seem to be oblivious to the essential to call the authorities. Do you remember what was said by certain witnesses? That Kate McCann apparently said, they've taken her, or we've let her down, or she's been taken. Not sure what the words are verbatim, but and then in a lot of their interviews, there's this blame that the authorities took so long to arrive, right? But what the journalists are saying is they seem to take a long time themselves to call the authorities. In any event, the GNR is the first to arrive at the scene, but the news only reaches Polizia Judiciaria more than 2 hours later. And one wonders how they know this. Did they check this with the Polizia Judiciaria? What is the actual situation? Based on the foregoing, it seems fairly accurate. The first explanations arise. Where were the parents when the child disappeared? Jerry explains that, inspired in the scheme that some of the friends had used on their holidays in Greece, the 9 members of the group took turns in checking on the children with some regularity. Oh, okay, so now we see why the previous holidaying together in Greece came up. Now we see why that's there. So suddenly it seems like on the night that Madeleine disappeared, suddenly it seemed, according to the article at least, it seems like now they are doing this regular checking. Had they been doing it all week? This is the beginning of a story that will change in many chapters. Jerry starts by saying that he first left the table to check on the children around about 9:05. When he entered the apartment, the children were fine. He just noticed that the door to their bedroom was partially open. He looked at the window, which was closed, just as the shutters were closed, and relaxed. 10 minutes later, his friend Jane Tanner, who went around the apartments, crossed ways with a dark-haired man who was walking in the opposite direction carrying a child. She didn't make any connections either. This would later turn out not to be accurate. Dr. Julian Totman wasn't walking in the opposite direction. He was actually walking from the creche with his child back to the Ocean Club because that's where he was actually staying. So this is actually not accurate. Tannerman was actually later, after 5 years of investigating Tannerman, was proved to be a false lead. A few minutes later, Matthew Oldfield enters the room. He sees the McCann children fast asleep and notices nothing out of the ordinary. It is at 10 p.m. that Maddie's mother discovers her daughter has disappeared. This is the critical part here. The window was wide open and the shutters were up. And the critical part here is this. The shutters were up. Really? To the GNR who were in the area with sniffer dogs to search for the child, this is a highly unlikely scenario. One member of the military assures this is an extremely silent area where there are practically no passing cars. That shutter was very difficult to lift from the outside and would have made a lot of noise. It would have been a lot easier to use the door, but there were no signs of a break-in. And this is 100% correct. I was in Pride Deluge myself. I tried, in the beginning I didn't actually know how the shutters worked, and I thought you could lift them from the outside. It is very, very difficult to lift them from the outside, and they make a tremendous racket. You'll only know that if you deal with it practically, right? And it's not only that there are kind of a cluster of apartments all over, and at 9 o'clock at night, especially in May, it's so quiet. Anybody opening a shutter anywhere you can hear for streets away. You can hear one shutter opening for a long distance away. So someone who is breaking into an apartment through a shutter is going to be sort of almost doing flick-flacks and waving a pom-pom saying, hey, everybody, I'm breaking in here, right? But the fact is that one of the doors of the apartment was unlocked anyway. So this part of the story doesn't make sense at all. Next paragraph. This was just one of the reasons why the group became suspicious in the eyes of the investigators. Russell O'Brien, Jane Tanner's husband, is already back in England, but he knows he could be summoned back to Portugal for a deposition any time. Over the phone with Sol, he tries to keep his British phlegm. It is normal that we are suspects, and the DNA test is a consequence thereof. We were the closest people involved. The conversation always comes back to the same issue, the night of the disappearance. The account of that last dinner has disparate versions among the group's members. Some swear that someone left the table every half hour to check on the kids. Others reduce that time to half of it. Some say control is made window by window. Others say the adults entered each other's apartments. So you have this situation where the staff are under the impression that they didn't even know the group had children because they never see them, and they never seem to get up to go and check on them. Then you have another sort of scenario where those members of the group giving their versions all give different versions. The timetable is different from one member to the other. The route in some instances is different from one member to the other. And then also what is actually done. Are some people checking window by window, or are they actually going inside the apartments? So there are all of these strange inconsistencies about something that should have been quite simple. For example, if you'd asked Dr. Julian Totman, what was your system of looking after your kid? It probably would be just one sentence. Oh, I take her to the creche each night and then I pick her up. And then how can you have an inconsistency with that? One of the employees that was on duty that evening does not remember a lot of movement. He says, I only remember a tall grey-haired man getting up once from the table. It was Russell, who 2 days earlier also had attended dinner. So that is a conflicting version from a member of staff who says, from what I can remember, only one person ever got up from the table. An aerobic instructor from the resort entertains the dinner guests at tapas with a quiz. At 9:30 p.m. the game ends and Jerry invites her to their table, where she stays for half an hour. During that time, as she later confides to friends, nobody left the table, but one of the chairs was vacant. Navoya Chekaya refuses to talk to Sol, and Russell, when the questions start to surround him, loses his sympathy. I think she means loses his patience. I have nothing further to tell you. I'm not going to dishonor the promise I assumed with Kate and Jerry. They want to control all information that is disclosed. And I think that is why the journalists assume this to be a pact of silence. Jerry changes his version several times, according to the article, but he maintains that the door to the children's room was open. Matt revokes his first statement when he entered Madeleine's room. The door was open and there was more light, as if the shutters had been raised. He starts to develop the theory that there was already someone inside the apartment, which reinforces Jane Tanner's version that she saw a man carrying a child. Only Jane saw the man carrying a child, and this is quite interesting, especially retrospectively. But there is a witness whose deposition contradicts this theory. Jeremy Wilkins, a TV producer who had met Maddie's father during their holidays and used to play tennis with him, was walking his 8-month-old son at that time. He met Jerry, who went through the apartment's back door after having checked on the children, and the two men exchanged a brief conversation. At that time, if one is to be believed, if one is to believe the first accounts, Jane would have left tapas in the direction of the apartment's main entrance and would have crossed paths with both of them. And then this is what he said, and I've stood on that road myself. It was a very narrow road, and I think it would have been almost impossible to walk by without me taking notice, Jeremy says, pointing out the fact that he saw no man carrying a child, as Jane states. But Jane continues to guarantee that at the top of the street she saw a man with a child in his arms. And I think you can interpret that in two ways. One is either that Jane did see a man, but he wasn't walking left to right, he was walking right to left. Or Jane didn't see a man, but she did know that a man would habitually walk back from the creche. In other words, she knew that it was Julian Totman, or she knew that a guy was walking around that night. I don't know. Although the area is scarcely lit, and the situation did not make her suspicious at the time. She describes the beige trousers, the dark thick jacket, and the black classic style shoes in a detailed way. Once again, Jeremy disagrees. He says, if that happened, I would have likely seen it. On the next day, the media circus was fully installed. The first reports on Sky News first thing in the morning, even before Portuguese press take hold of the story. So the British folk at the Ocean Club already get the story of an abduction and a break-in and everything into the British media even before it comes out in the Portuguese media. Another thing that is really interesting is that you have the Tanner sighting that is sort of heralded and celebrated. And bear in mind, there's like Portuguese secrecy laws. We're not really supposed to reveal the details of investigations. So what happens? Jane Tanner, who's a member of the group, tells everyone about this person that she saw walking to the away from the hotel to the right-hand side, right? I guess it's to the west side, to the east side, and but there's also another sighting that night, but that sighting is kept private because it's part of the investigation. Both sightings should have been kept private and part of the investigation, but one of them isn't because Jane Tanner reveals it, I guess, to the media. And so the one sighting gains precedence and preference and is the subject of the media and the public's interest when it's later debunked anyway. One wonders, was that a strategy, a successful strategy? Did that happen by accident, or is that just bad luck? It says, journalists and locals dispute the information. Robert Murat, the son of an English mother and a Portuguese father, with little luck in business, does not waste the opportunity. He moves from failed businessman into the role of a translator for the press and the police. Some British journalists, after sucking him to the bones, start suspecting his availability. The Murat contradiction. Contrarily to the GNR elements and the Ocean Club staff who participated in the searches on the night before and assure they did not see Murat around, Jerry and some of his friends guarantee that he was there, and thus he becomes an arguido. So it's kind of based on this article, certainly, that based on the Tapas, some members of the Tapas group, they say we definitely saw Robert Murat, and so he becomes a suspect. So it's quite strange. It's quite a strange scenario that the Tapas group don't see anything, and there's this pact of silence, with the exception that they do see Robert Murat, and then he becomes an arguido. Jerry and Kate's friends, who are interrogated tightly by the PJ over almost a month, refuse to clarify this contradiction when asked by Sol. In other words, why do the GNR and the Ocean Club staff, they didn't see Robert Murat, but some of your friends did? Why is that? And they apparently said, we have a pact. This is our matter only. It's private. It's nobody else's business. And this was apparently according to what David Payne said, who was a member of the Tapas 7. Minutes after we tried to contact Kate, Jerry, in a fury, calls the Sol journalist. He says, what do you think you are doing? Do you think you're better than the Portuguese police? I'm going to forward your contact details to PJ, to the Polícia Judiciária, and you will have to explain yourselves. The Polícia Judiciária, this is how the article concludes, says everybody is a suspect. The director of the Polícia Judiciária in Faro, I'm not going to say his name, what's it, Guilhermino de Encarnacio. Anyway, the directors confirmed with Sol that we do not discard the possibility of having the family and friends as suspects. This is always done without neglecting other clues. Everybody who was at the resort at the time are suspects. And that is how the article concludes. That is how this Pact of Silence article concludes, is that everybody who was at the resort at the time are suspects. Well, look at where we are now. Look at where we are today. Now, none of those who were at the resort are suspects. How does that work? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.